Negotiating with Tehran was a 62-day sprint set against a ticking clock, and when that timer ran out, well, the region exploded. Welcome to the deep dive. We've gathered together a collection of key sources detailing those really intense, high-stakes 2025 negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. You might remember these talks kicked off after a direct letter from President Donald Trump to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. But they came with a catch, a strict 2-month deadline. So our mission today is to unpack that hardline U.S. strategy, the maximum pressure campaign, and really show how Iran's, well, its fundamental defiance just pushed this whole diplomatic effort right to the breaking point. And the result, regional war. We're going to cut through some of the rhetoric, look at the actual demands, the critical failures, and ultimately the outcome of those 62 days. Why did it end in conflict?
Well, to really get those 62 days, you absolutely have to look at what happened right before. I mean, the stage was basically set by the perceived failure of the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Remember, the U.S. pulled out back in 2018. The administration at the time, their public view was that the deal was, and I'm quoting here, a giant fiction.
Right, a giant fiction. And the reason they use that term is pretty critical because it really shaped the new demands, didn't it?
Exactly. The argument was the old deal just conveniently sidestepped two huge ongoing threats.
Which were?
Iran's ballistic missile program, which kept advancing, and, crucially, it's funding its financial lifeline to proxy terror groups all over the Middle East.
Okay, so fast forward to February 2025, the U.S. objective seems crystal clear. Use maximum pressure, squeeze them to force a new deal.
A new deal that would permanently, absolutely prevent Iran from ever getting nuclear weapons. That was the bottom line.
And this wasn't just talk. It was backed up by that explicit warning, the classic phrase, all options are on the table if diplomacy failed.
And that phrase, all options are on the table, it just instantly set the tone, didn't it? It defined the whole atmosphere. This wasn't your typical diplomacy in some comfortable neutral setting. No, this was happening under a massive military shadow. We're talking about 50,000 American troops, roughly, already positioned across bases in the region.
So it was designed really as a test of strength, forcing a regime they viewed as hostile to the table, but under conditions where the U.S. felt it had overwhelming leverage. Let's talk about how difficult those actual discussions were. I mean, you had U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi nominally leading.
Nominally, yes. But they were never in the same room.
Never in the same room, so completely indirect talks.
Completely indirect. Often mediated through Oman, actually. That just shows you the level of mistrust right from the start.
Yeah.
5 rounds between April and May 2025.
5 rounds, mediated by Oman. It really paints a picture of just how little common ground there was to begin with.
And through all that indirect back and forth, one single demand became the absolute sticking point, the immovable object, the red line, really, for the whole 62 days.
Which was?
Uranium enrichment.
Ah, enrichment.
The U.S. position, and this reflects that conservative strategic view that fundamentally this regime cannot be trusted with any path to a bomb, was total dismantlement. No ifs, ands, or buts.
And total dismantlement, just to be clear for everyone listening, means giving it all up, right? Surrendering the capability entirely.
That's it. The U.S. insisted Iran dismantle its enrichment facilities, specifically naming Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, and ship out all its existing enriched uranium stockpiles. Send them to a third country, somewhere verifiable.
And that was the absolute requirement for the U.S. to even begin to believe Iran wasn't pursuing nukes, non-negotiable.
And Iran's response?
Let me guess. Not positive.
Immediate. Total defiance. Supreme Leader Khamenei himself publicly called the demand excessive and outrageous. He declared enrichment was central to Iran's national program, their sovereign right. And his advisor, Khamenei, just arrogantly dismissed the U.S. demands for control as, quote, a fantasy.
A fantasy. Wow, so it sounds like Iran wasn't really negotiating in good faith. Maybe just playing for time, or trying to look reasonable while offering things they knew would fail.
It certainly looked that way. Our sources point to proposals like, okay, they offered a seeming concession freezing support for proxies like Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah.
Sounds good, right?
On the surface, maybe? But what was the catch?
The catch was their counter-demand. They proposed building 19 additional nuclear reactors.
19, while supposedly negotiating limits. That sounds provocative.
Highly provocative.
Yeah.
It really signaled they were focused on expanding capability, not compromise. And their other big demand, interestingly, wasn't just about sanctions relief.
What was it then? They kept pushing for ironclad guarantees that the U.S. wouldn't just walk away from a future deal again. It showed this deep, deep mistrust. They saw the U.S. as the unreliable one.
So the whole dynamic sounds less like negotiation and more like positioning. Each side moving towards the next escalation rather than finding actual common ground.
That's a good way to put it. And that brings us to the clock running out, because as the diplomacy was visibly failing, the evidence started piling up that Iran wasn't just stalling. They were actively accelerating their nuclear program.
Which, from the U.S. perspective, would validate the whole maximum pressure approach, wouldn't it? Proof of bad faith.
Precisely. And there were critical pieces of evidence.
What were they?
Well, first, by May 31st, the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, they reported Iran had amassed a record amount of military-grade enriched uranium.
A record amount. So not slowing down, but speeding up dramatically.
Exactly. Directly contradicting any claims of peaceful intent they might have been making in those indirect talks.
And wasn't there something else? Something about a new site?
Yes, the second piece is really worrying. It speaks to more advanced weaponization goals. Fox News broke a story based on satellite images about an alleged, previously unknown Iranian nuclear facility. The Rainbow site, they called it, 2,500 acres.
Okay. And what was supposedly happening there?
The reports indicated it was involved in tritium extraction.
Tritium. Why is that significant?
Because, tritium extraction has almost no peaceful civilian use. Its main known function is as a booster material in advanced thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs.
So if true, this wasn't just about a basic atomic bomb anymore. This suggested they were going for something much more powerful.
A much more sophisticated capability, yes. Now, Iran immediately dismissed it, called it Israeli-driven propaganda. But, the damage to any remaining trust was done.
And meanwhile, back in Washington, the pressure on the U.S. negotiators must have been intense from their own side, too.
Oh, absolutely. Republican senators were publicly warning that any deal that allowed Iran any level of enrichment was dead on arrival. It wouldn't pass the Senate. They were demanding total dismantlement, period.
And at the same time, the rhetoric from Tehran was heating up.
Turning openly hostile. You had the Revolutionary Guard General Salami warning they would, quote, open hellgates on invaders. Very direct threats.
So you can see the pieces moving into place. The U.S. military starts reacting.
Right. Defense Secretary Hegseth began preparing the public, didn't mince words, announcing the U.S. military was, quote, getting ready. The shift from failed diplomacy to potential military confrontation was clearly happening.
And you really see that starkly on June 11th, don't you, with the embassy evacuations?
Yes. U.S. embassies in Iraq, other vulnerable Arab states, they started rapidly evacuating non-essential personnel.
Which is always a major sign. When the diplomats pull out, it usually means military action is seen as highly likely, even imminent.
And this was explicitly linked to specific Iranian threats against American bases in the region. It wasn't theoretical anymore.
Okay, so the fuse is lit. What was the final diplomatic step, the thing that made it irreversible?
That came just one day later, June 12, 2025. The IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, officially declared Iran non-compliant with its non-proliferation obligations.
Non-compliant? That's a formal, serious declaration.
Huge. It was the first time in 20 years they had issued such a definitive finding, and they cited Iran's repeated failures to answer questions about undeclared nuclear material and activities.
And Iran's response to being formally called out by the IAEA.
Immediate defiance. Calculated defiance, really. They instantly announced plans to build a new enrichment site and install even more advanced centrifuges.
Wow. So basically doubling down right after being declared non-compliant.
Exactly. That was really the point of no return.
So the IAEA declaration confirms the bad faith. The 2-month clock runs out the very next day, June 13th. Iran hasn't dismantled anything. The 62 days are officially over. What happens next?
Immediate military action. Starting that same day, June 13th, Israel launched strikes. Multiple targets across Iran. The stated goal, preventing nuclear weapons development. They hit key facilities, and significantly, reports indicate they killed top Iranian military leaders.
And the U.S. reaction, was there any hesitation?
None whatsoever. President Trump immediately came out, offered explicit support to Israel. He said, of course, the U.S. supported the action, and he specifically tied it to the diplomatic deadline having just expired.
A very clear signal endorsing decisive action when diplomacy fails.
Absolutely. And the U.S. didn't wait long to act itself. Just 8 days later, June 21st.
What did the U.S. target?
They began their own targeted strikes.
Right.
They bombed the Fordo uranium enrichment facility, the one buried deep underground. They hit the Natanz nuclear facility and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center, a direct, powerful assault aimed squarely at crippling Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
And the public justification from President Trump really summed up that maximum pressure philosophy, didn't it?
It did. He put it very bluntly. You essentially had a nuclear Iran, and I blasted the hell out of him. Plain language.
A ceasefire was eventually declared, but the U.S. position remained firm.
Absolutely firm. U.S. officials made it clear. The American demand now was that Iran must halt all uranium enrichment. And that demand was no longer just diplomatic, it was backed by military force.
Which brings us to the really crucial long-term question. Did all this, the maximum pressure, the sanctions, the eventual military strikes, did it actually work? Did it lead to regime collapse or even just a change in their behavior?
Well, based on the sources we have, the answer is kind of counterintuitive. It seems that far from collapsing the regime, the pressure and the strikes actually appear to have solidified the power of the hardliners.
Hardened their resolve, you mean?
Exactly. You see it reflected clearly in Supreme Leader Khamenei's speech later that year, November 2025. He dismissed the U.S. bombing claims as nonsense. But more importantly, he insisted the conflict with the U.S. wasn't just some temporary policy dispute. He called it intrinsic, permanent.
Intrinsic and permanent. That doesn't sound like someone looking for reconciliation.
Not at all. And that deep hostility came through in this impossible ultimatum he issued. It shows just how far apart the two sides still were, even after the strikes.
What was the ultimatum?
Khamenei said Iran would only consider future cooperation if Washington met 3 conditions. Basically impossible conditions.
Which were?
1,
Yeah.
completely cut all U.S. backing for Israel. 2, remove all U.S. military bases from the entire region. And 3, stop all interference in regional affairs. And then he added, almost wryly, that he didn't expect these conditions to be met in the near future, effectively slamming the door shut on any real dialogue.
Okay, this is where we really need to dig into that economic paradox you mentioned earlier, the sanctions strategy, because it seems key to understanding why the regime is so resilient, right?
It is key. The maximum pressure campaign, the sanctions, they absolutely inflicted devastating, verifiable economic pain on the ordinary Iranian people.
We have numbers on that.
We do. Sources indicate over 8 million Iranians fell from the middle class down to the lower middle class. Poverty rates spiked. And this hardship fueled domestic unrest, like those November 2019 fuel price protests, which were met with brutal repression.
So the economic pain was real. That was supposed to create leverage, pressure the regime from within.
That was the theory. But here's the unexpected and frankly corrosive result. The hardline, anti-Western elements within the regime, particularly those around the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, they actually benefited.
Wait, how did the IRGC benefit from sanctions that were supposed to cripple the state? That seems backwards.
It does, but it happened because they essentially control the shadow economy. When legitimate trade is choked off, who controls the black markets? Who controls the smuggling routes to bypass sanctions? Who benefits from state-sponsored corruption that's now shielded from international oversight?
The
IRGC. Their business empires, tied to these illicit activities, reportedly mushroomed under maximum pressure. Sanctions isolated the country, yes, but they also concentrated wealth and power within the very military security apparatus the sanctions were supposed to weaken.
So the strategy designed to starve the regime of funds for its military and proxy adventures, it inadvertently ended up making the IRGC richer and more powerful.
That's what the analysis suggests. It unintentionally made the regime more defiant, certainly more centralized, and crucially more militarized, because it put more resources and control into the hands of the IRGC hardliners, a really devastating long-term consequence of those 62 days and the policy itself.
It really does paint a picture of a zero-sum game, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. The U.S. demanded total nuclear surrender because it fundamentally viewed the Iranian regime as hostile, as deceptive, as untrustworthy. And Iran, seeing that demand for total surrender, used it as justification to refuse any real negotiation and instead double down on defiance, ramp up enrichment.
So those 62 days of talks, they weren't really a path to a deal. They were more like the final countdown.
The final countdown to a military clash that, looking back, many on both sides probably saw as inevitable once that old, flawed JCPOA route was abandoned.
The negotiation failed, fundamentally, because that core issue, Iran's insistence on a right to enrich, was just completely non-negotiable for Tehran. And this whole episode really highlights that strategic, conservative viewpoint. That diplomacy with a determined adversary, especially one pursuing nuclear weapons, is often futile unless it's backed by a credible, decisive threat of force. And in this case, that threat ultimately became a reality.
Which leads us to the final really provocative question we want to leave you with today. If this maximum pressure strategy caused immense suffering for the Iranian people, but actually ended up strengthening the regime's military core, the IRGC, What leverage does the international community realistically have left? What tools are there to compel a nuclear deal now, especially after the two sides have already traded blows and that hostility seems utterly cemented?